step outside, right? Maybe into a park or, just your backyard. Looks simple enough. Trees, birds, dirt.
Mm-hmm.
But then you look closer,
Mm-hmm.
and it's this incredibly complex interwoven system.
Yeah, absolutely. Life interacting with non-life. It's this constant dance shaping everything.
It really is. And it reveals these surprising connections everywhere.
Far more than just like a list of plants and animals, it's how they all work together in that specific place.
And that intricate system, the ecosystem, that's exactly what we're digging into today. We've got this great material that covers, well, everything from the real basics.
Building blocks.
Yeah, the building blocks right up to how energy moves, how life interacts, how we even study these things,
Yeah.
and critically, how humans fit in or sometimes mess things up and what we can maybe do about it.
Exactly. The idea isn't just to read off facts, it's to pull out the core concepts, those aha moments. So you get a real feel for how these vital systems function, why they're so important, and yeah, the challenges they face.
Okay, let's jump right in then. When we talk ecosystems, what are the absolute fundamentals the sources lay out?
Okay, so at its core, an ecosystem is basically the combination of the living parts, what we call biotic,
Yeah.
and the non-living parts, the abiotic, within a certain area, and crucially, how they interact. It's the whole shebang in one place.
So biotic,
Yeah.
that seems pretty straightforward. Plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, anything alive.
Exactly. And abiotic is, well, everything else, the physical and chemical stuff. Air, water, rocks, soil temperature.
Got it. The stage, sort of.
Precisely. And within that biotic side, the material breaks it down further, a population. That's just the number of individuals of one species in that spot.
Okay.
Put all the different populations together, all the species living there, and you've got a community.
And that community lives somewhere specific.
Yeah.
Its habitat.
Right. Habitat's the address, you could say,
Mhm.
where an organism or population lives, finds its food, reproduces. But the sources also stress it's not just where, it's what they do.
The niche.
Yeah, the niche. Each species has its own specific role or job in that ecosystem. Think about like what it eats, what eats it, how it changes the environment around it. It's that unique part it plays in the whole web.
So ecosystem, the whole system. The stage, abiotic. The actors,
Mhm.
populations, communities, biotic. Their roles, niches.
Hmm.
And how they all interact and influence each other.
Okay.
And those abiotic factors, the non-living stuff, they must be huge drivers, right?
Oh, absolutely fundamental. The material lists several key ones: temperature, humidity, pH levels, water availability, light intensity, oxygen levels, salinity, like saltiness.
Huge differences there.
Totally. Just picture a freshwater lake versus, say, a salt marsh, or a super sunny mountaintop versus a dark cave. These non-living things dictate what kind of life can even survive, let alone thrive there.
Yeah, like water in a desert, that's everything.
Exactly. Or how much light gets down through the trees in a dense forest. That shapes the whole understory.
Okay, and the living side, the biotic factors,
Yeah.
they're mostly defined by how energy flows. The food chain.
That's a huge part of it, yeah. The foundation almost always is the producers. These are the organisms, usually plants or algae, that make their own food.
Photosynthesis.
Right, usually photosynthesis. They're the start of the food chain. Then you have the consumers. They get energy by eating other organisms.
So herbivores eating the producers.
Yep, eating plants. And carnivores eating other consumers, other animals.
And we break down consumers based on where they are in that chain.
We do. Primary consumers munch on the producers. Secondary consumers eat those primary consumers. And tertiary consumers, well, they eat the secondary ones. It's this flow, right? Energy and matter moving up. And you absolutely cannot forget the decomposers.
No, the recyclers. Fungi, bacteria.
Exactly. They break down all the dead stuff, dead plants, dead animals, waste. And in doing that, they release vital nutrients back into the soil or water, making them available for the producers to use again. Super important. Without them, everything just piles up.
Wow, okay. So we've got the stage, abiotic, the actors, biotic communities, populations, niches, and the energy flow, producers, consumers, decomposers. How do these actors, the living things, actually interact?
Good question. The sources point out some key relationships that really define the dynamics. 3 big ones are competition, predation, and pollination.
Competition. That seems obvious. Fighting over stuff.
Pretty much. Organisms needing the same limited resources. For animals, that could be food, water, mates, space, shelter. For plants, it's often light, water, minerals from the soil, even just root space.
Constant struggle.
It's a major force shaping who lives where and how many there are. Then there's predation.
The classic hunter and hunted scenario.
Yep. One organism, the predator, hunts, kills, and eats another, the prey. It's a direct energy transfer, obviously, but it also drives evolution. Prey get better at escaping, predators get better at catching.
And pollination. That seems to
Yeah, it often is, yeah. A fantastic example of interdependence. It's how pollen gets transferred from the male part of a flower to the female part, allowing the plant to make seeds.
often needs help, right? Wind or insects.
Exactly. Wind can do it, but often it involves animals, especially insects like bees, butterflies, even bats or birds sometimes. The plant offers a reward, like nectar, and the animal accidentally or purposefully moves the pollen. Vital for so many plants and the ecosystems they support.
It really shows how tangled up everything is.
Yeah.
And it all runs on energy, starting with those producers.
Absolutely. The engine for most life on Earth is photosynthesis. The sources explain it simply. Green plants use that green pigment, chlorophyll, to capture sunlight. They take in CO2 and water and zap. They make glucose sugar, their food, and release oxygen.
That's the first step, capturing the sun's energy.
Turning it into biological energy, yeah. And then that energy gets passed along through food chains. You know, A eats B, C eats A.
Which get tangled up into food webs.
Right. Much more realistic, because most things eat more than one thing and are eaten by more than one thing. Each step, each link in that chain or web is called a trophic level.
Okay, trophic level. And we can draw pictures of this, right? Pyramids.
We can. Ecological pyramids. The sources mention two main types. A pyramid of numbers just shows how many individual organisms are at each level. Usually, loads of producers at the bottom, fewer primary consumers, even fewer secondary, and so on.
Makes sense.
But the really telling one is the pyramid of energy. This shows how much energy is actually available at each trophic level.
And this is where that big drop-off happens.
Exactly. This is a fundamental concept the material hits hard. Only about 10% of the energy from one trophic level actually makes it into the biomass of the next level up.
Wow, only 10%. Where does the other 90% go?
It gets used. The organisms use it to live for respiration, movement, growth, keeping warm. A lot is lost as heat. Some is in parts that don't get eaten or ends up as waste. So only a small fraction is actually converted into the body of the thing that gets eaten next.
That explains why food chains aren't usually very long.
Precisely. There just isn't enough energy left to support many levels. That pyramid shape is a direct result of this energy loss. The lake example in the material is great. Millions of tiny plants supporting maybe thousands of tiny animals, hundreds of small fish, tens of larger fish, and maybe one or two herons.
That 10% rule really shapes everything. Okay, so energy flows through. What about matter? Stuff like carbon.
That cycles. The carbon cycle is a key example. The sources detail. Carbon is constantly moving. It's in the air as CO2.
Plants grab it for photosynthesis.
Right. Then animals get it by eating plants or eating animals that ate plants. Both plants and animals release CO2 back into the air when they respire, when they breathe and use energy.
And when things die.
Decomposers break them down. That releases carbon too, either back to the atmosphere through their own respiration, or it becomes part of the organic matter in the soil, like humus.
And burning stuff.
Big one. Burning wood, or, significantly, fossil fuels, releases huge amounts of carbon that was locked away, often for millions of years, straight back into the atmosphere as CO2. The material really highlights how this human activity is, well, rapidly changing the balance of that cycle.
A cycle that was relatively stable before. Okay, so we understand the structure, the interactions, the energy flow, the cycles. How do scientists actually, measure this stuff out in the field? It seems incredibly complex.
It is. But there are standard methods. The sources describe several ways to estimate biodiversity or sample populations. For a quick look, there's the ACFOR scale.
ACFOR.
Yeah, just stands for abundant, common, frequent, occasional, rare. It gives you a rough idea of how often you're seeing a particular species. Simple, but useful for a first pass.
Okay, quick and dirty. What about more detailed counts?
A very common tool is the quadrat, usually a square frame, often a meter by a meter. You lay it down in the area you're studying.
And just count what's inside.
Count species, yeah. Or estimate how many individuals of a species there are, or estimate the percentage of the ground covered by a certain plant. Gives you quantitative data for that small sample area.
And if things are changing across an area, like going up a hill,
then you'd likely use a transect. Basically, you lay out a measuring tape or rope that's your line, the transect. Then you place your quadrats at regular intervals along that line, maybe every 5 meters or 10 meters.
So you can see how the community changes along that environmental gradient.
Exactly. And how you place those quadrats or lines is important too. The sources mention random sampling.
Like throwing the quadrat. Or using random numbers on a grid.
Yep, trying to avoid any unconscious bias in where you sample. versus systematic sampling, like placing quadrats every 5 meters along that transect line. It depends on the question you're asking. They also mention estimating percentage cover over larger areas by combining multiple quadrat samples.
What about for things that move, like bugs?
Good point. You can use pitfall traps.
Wow.
These are just jars or containers sunk into the ground so the rim is level with the surface. Little critters crawling along just fall in.
Terrible.
And effective for ground-dwelling invertebrates. Or there's a pooter.
A pooter. Seriously.
Yeah. It's a little jar with 2 tubes. You put one tube over a small insect and suck on the other tube. There's a mesh filter so you don't inhale the bug. And it sucks the insects safely into the jar. Good for collecting things off leaves without squashing them.
Clever. But the sources also talk about the downsides of these methods, right?
They do, which is crucial. No method's perfect. Quadrats. They're quick, cheap, easy to carry. Great. But the material notes, a single quadrat isn't always super accurate for the whole area. You need enough random samples to be representative, otherwise your sample could be biased.
Makes sense.
Transects share those good points. Quick, cheap, portable, but they need to be used where there actually is a gradient. Sometimes people use them inappropriately. And you still need to be careful about placement. Pitfall traps. Cheap, easy. But a big downside highlighted is they often kill the creatures that fall in. And depending on how active different species are, they might oversample some and undersample others.
So studying ecosystems involves practical choices and trade-offs. It's not always straightforward.
Definitely not. It shows that getting reliable data in complex natural systems is a challenge in itself.
Okay, that leads us, unfortunately, to the pressures these systems face. Habitat loss is a massive one discussed in the sources.
Yeah, it's cited as the single biggest cause of species going extinct worldwide, and the material gives some really stark examples like wetlands.
Wetlands, marshes, bogs, swamps.
Exactly. They only cover maybe 6 or 7% of the Earth's land, but the benefits they provide are huge, outsized impact.
Like flood control you mentioned.
Yeah, they act like natural sponges, soaking up floodwater. They filter pollutants, improving water quality downstream. They protect coastlines from erosion and storm surges. They help recharge underground water sources, aquifers, and they are incredibly important habitats for countless birds, fish, amphibians, insects.
Plus people use them directly, right?
Absolutely. Sources of fish, wildfowl, fuel like peat, plant fibers for weaving, very valuable for local communities.
Yet we're losing them incredibly fast. Why?
The list of causes is pretty grim. A lot is drainage for farming, for forestry, building tourist resorts, industrial sites like power plants needing cooling water. Dredging channels for flood protection alters them. They get used as dumps for waste disposal, fill for road construction, pollutants get discharged into them, peat gets mined for fuel or garden soil, groundwater gets pumped out, drying them up, even efforts to control diseases like malaria by draining mosquito breeding grounds. It all adds up.
Often seems like short-term economic gain over long-term ecological value.
That's often the dynamic, sadly. The ecosystem services they provide for free are rarely factored into those decisions.
And farming itself can be a problem. Intensive agriculture.
Yeah, the sources mention monoculture, just growing vast areas of a single crop. This can really deplete specific soil nutrients over time, and it drastically reduces biodiversity compared to a natural landscape or even more traditional mixed farming. Fewer habitats, fewer food sources for wildlife.
Another huge one highlighted is deforestation, especially forests and rainforests.
Massive issue. The drivers are varied. Huge demand for wood for building, fuel, furniture, paper, clearing land for farming, both small-scale subsistence farming and large industrial plantations like for palm oil or cattle ranching. Building roads, expanding settlements, mining and extracting minerals.
And the knock-on effects are just huge.
Devastating, really. The impacts listed are interconnected. Obvious one. Loss of habitat. Countless species depend on those forests. Lose the forest, they lose their home, pushing them towards extinction.
Animals lose food too.
Right. If they eat specific trees, fruits, nuts, insects found only there, gone. Forests produce vast amounts of oxygen. Less forest, less oxygen. Tree roots hold soil together. Cutting them down leads to massive soil erosion from rain and wind.
Flooding too.
Yeah, the forest floor and roots soak up water. Without them, water runs off much faster, increasing flood risk downstream. Native peoples often rely culturally and physically on forests. Deforestation destroys their way of life. And the climate links. Trees absorb CO2. Fewer trees means more CO2 stays in the atmosphere, worsening the enhanced greenhouse effect and driving climate change.
It's like pulling threads from a tapestry. Everything starts to unravel. But okay, it's not all doom and gloom. The material does talk about solutions, right? Conservation strategies.
Yes, absolutely. There's a strong focus on the need for sustainable management, especially for forests. They're just two important vital habitats, reservoirs of genetic diversity, sources of food, medicine, materials, and crucial for those big ecosystem services like regulating the carbon and water cycles.
You mentioned carbon sinks versus stores earlier.
Right. Important distinction the sources make. Young, actively growing forests are carbon sinks. They pull in more CO2 than they release as they build biomass. Mature forests are more like carbon stores. They hold vast amounts of carbon, but their net uptake might be close to zero unless disturbed. Protecting both is vital, the sinks to keep absorbing, the stores to keep that carbon locked up.
And their role in the water cycle and preventing erosion is key too.
Definitely. Transpiration from trees puts a lot of water vapor back into the atmosphere, influencing rainfall. The canopy intercepts rain, softening its impact, and roots hold the soil. Though, ironically, some logging practices can compact the soil, which reduces water infiltration.
So managing them well is crucial. What are some of the specific strategies discussed? National, international levels.
Okay, one core idea is sustainable harvesting of wild species, generally taking only what can be replenished, leaving enough for the future.
Applies to fish, timber, everything.
Exactly. For forests specifically, there's sustainable forestry. This involves things like setting aside protected areas, identifying and conserving high conservation value forests, like those critical for biodiversity or local communities, having proper management plans, which might include selective logging.
Only taking certain trees.
Yeah, maybe trees of a certain size or species, and only cutting a limited number, maybe only returning to an area after many years to allow recovery. Using reduced impact logging techniques to minimize damage to remaining trees and soil. And of course, reforestation and afforestation, planting trees where they've been lost or weren't before.
What about integrating trees in farming?
That's agroforestry. Really interesting approach. Growing crops around trees or letting livestock graze in woodlands. The sources mention benefits like trees enriching the soil with leaf litter or nitrogen fixation, providing food or firewood, and their roots still help hold the soil.
Improving laws and checking up on companies seems like a basic need too.
Absolutely essential. Provides the rules and enforcement. Then there's the whole strategy of protected areas, national parks, wildlife reserves, ecological reserves, places specifically managed for conservation.
And connecting them.
Crucial. Wildlife corridors. Strips of habitat that link larger protected areas that might have become fragmented by roads or farms. Allows animals to move between areas, maintaining genetic diversity and letting populations support each other.
What about balancing conservation with local people's needs?
That's where ideas like extractive reserves come in, mentioned in the material. The goal is to allow local communities to continue using certain forest resources like rubber tapping or gathering nuts in a sustainable way, giving them a stake in conserving the forest rather than clearing it.
And on a bigger international scale.
World Biosphere Reserves. These are UNESCO-designated areas intended as learning places for sustainable development. They typically have 3 zones: a strictly protected core area for research and monitoring, a surrounding buffer zone where activities compatible with conservation occur, like education and research, and an outer transition area where communities and agencies work together on sustainable economic and human activities.
Trying to integrate people and nature on a landscape level.
That's the idea. Then there are strategies focused on preserving genetic diversity or specific populations. Seed banks are huge.
Like a backup hard drive for plants.
Kind of. Massive collections of seeds from thousands, millions of varieties, kept frozen, protected. It's insurance against extinction in the wild, but also a vital resource for future crop breeding, finding genes for disease resistance, drought tolerance, better nutrition. Invaluable.
And for animals, zoos.
Zoos and captive breeding programs play a role, especially for critically endangered species. They protect animals from immediate threats, try to breed them to build up numbers sometimes for reintroduction back into the wild, though that's complex. Plus, they have roles in education and research.
Lastly, something maybe more familiar to many listeners. Sustainable tourism.
Or ecotourism, yeah.
Yeah.
The idea is responsible travel to natural areas that actively conserves the environment and improves the well-being of local people. It should involve education, interpretation. It's about minimizing the negative impacts. Tourism often has waste, resource use, disturbance, and ideally making tourism a force for conservation.
So encouraging visitors and operators to protect the environment, support local businesses, respect local culture.
That's the aim. It's tourism trying to be part of the solution, not the problem.
Okay, wow. We have covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We started with those fundamental building blocks, biotic, abiotic, how they combine into ecosystems.
Right, and the roles within that. Populations, communities, habitats, niches.
Then how life interacts, competition, predation, that vital pollination link. And the energy engine photosynthesis, capturing sunlight, flowing through trophic levels in food chains and webs.
With that crucial 90% energy loss at each step really shaping the structure visualized in those ecological pyramids.
And we looked at how matter cycles, like the carbon cycle, its natural flow, and how we're impacting it. Plus how scientists actually measure these things with tools like quadrats and transects, acknowledging the challenges.
Then we shifted to the serious threats habitat loss, focusing on those vital wetlands and forests driven by agriculture, development, resource extraction.
Seeing those interconnected, devastating impacts on species, soil, water, climate, people.
But we didn't end there. We explored that whole range of conservation strategies trying to counter those threats. Sustainable harvesting, sustainable forestry, agroforestry.
Protected areas, corridors, biosphere reserves, trying to manage landscapes.
Seed banks and captive breeding, safeguarding genetic diversity in populations. And promoting responsible ecotourism.
It really paints this picture of incredible interconnectedness, doesn't it? From the tiniest decomposer microbe up to global climate patterns, all linked. The material lays out the science, the problems, and, thankfully, a lot of potential solutions.
It really does, and maybe that leaves you, the listener, with a final thought to chew on. Considering the sheer intricate web of connections, we've talked about how a fungus is linked to a giant tree, how a choice here might affect conservation somewhere else. What's one small step you could take? Maybe just to learn a bit more or appreciate more deeply these incredible, complex ecosystems that ultimately support all of us.